I have ridden into a good many towns in my life and felt nothing at all towns that were just feed and water and a roof for the night. Towns I passed through the way wind passes through a gap in the rocks, leaving no mark and carrying none away. Harlan's Crossing was not one of those towns. Harlan's Crossing had a hold on me, the way a burr has a hold on wool, quiet, persistent, and painful if you tried to pull it free all at once. I had spent 15 years trying not to think about it, and had failed every single day. The morning I rode back in, the cottonwoods along the Sutter Road had gone to gold. October and cold enough that my horse, a rangy gray I'd picked up in Elko, was putting fog into the air with every step. I had no plan. I want to say that plainly. I am a man who has spent a good portion of his adult life making plans, mining plans, partnership plans, plans for where to dig and how deep, and who would carry what out of the shaft, and nearly every one of them had come to nothing. The plan I'd had at 30, the one that involved Nora Callum and a piece of land east of town, and a house with a proper window facing the mountains, that one I had abandoned without understanding what I was leaving, until I was too far gone to ride back without swallowing something hard and jagged. So I rode into Harlan's Crossing on a gray October morning with no plan at all, which may have been the wisest thing I had done in 15 years. The town was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had made it larger in memory, the way a man does with things he has lost, built it up in the mind into something grander than it ever was, because the mind cannot bear to think it gave up something small. The main street was still packed dirt, still flanked by the same clapboard fronts, still anchored at the north end by Dearborn's Mercantile, and at the south by the livery that had been there since before I'd first arrived as a young man of 29 looking for work and finding, instead, a woman who sorted the post. The postal house had a room above the sorting office. I knew that room. I had sat in it 100 times, drinking coffee I did not deserve from a woman who was too patient with me by half. The window of that room faced west, which meant in the evenings the light came through it amber and slow. Nora had put a lamp in that window every night as far back as I could remember, not for any reason she ever stated aloud, just because she said a lamp in a window was a courtesy to whatever darkness was outside it. I used to tease her about that. I used to say the darkness did not require a courtesy. She would say she was not doing it for the darkness. She was doing it for anyone who might be coming toward it who needed to know that something warm was on the other side. I had thought about that lamp a great many times in 15 years. The lamp was in the window. I pulled up in the street and sat my horse and looked at it for longer than I should have. It was morning, so there was no need for the lamp. The October sun was well up and doing its work, but the lamp was there anyway, set in the window the way it always had been set, as though it had not been moved since the last time I'd seen it, as though it was permanent, as though she intended it to outlast everything. I did not knock right away. I am not proud of this, but I sat my horse in the street for a while first, trying to decide whether I was about to make a fool of myself or whether I had already been one for 15 years and was now, belatedly, making the corrective move. The two feelings were hard to separate. They had the same texture. What decided me was this. I had ridden 260 miles in 11 days on a horse I'd had to bargain hard for, through weather that had turned sideways on me twice, with nothing in my pack but the clothes I was wearing and a little money, and a letter I had written and never sent. The letter was folded into the breast pocket of my coat, where it had lived for 6 weeks. I had written it in Elko, sitting in a rooming house in the rain, after a conversation with an old Cornish miner named Avery who had told me, unprompted, that the only thing a man regrets on his deathbed is not the thing he tried and failed, but the thing he was too frightened to try at all. Avery had died 3 days later, a cave-in on the lower level, and somehow that had settled it for me. I tied the gray at the post and walked to the door of the postal house. I raised my hand to knock. The door opened. Nora Callum stood in the doorway in a gray wool dress and an apron, holding a broom she'd evidently been about to take to the front step. She looked at me the way I have seen a person look at a word they have been trying to recall all morning: recognition, and something behind it that might have been relief, and something behind that which I could not name. She was not surprised. That was the thing I noticed first. She was not surprised to see me. She said, "Reuben Hatch." Not a question, not an exclamation. Just my name, said the way a person says the name of something they have been waiting for without knowing quite when it would arrive. I said, "Nora." She stood aside and held the door open. I went in. I ought to go back to the beginning, though I suspect the beginning matters less than what came after. I arrived in Harlan's Crossing in the spring of my 29th year with a mule, a prospector's kit, and a letter of introduction to a man named Dearborn who ran the mercantile and served as a kind of informal employment broker for the region. The silver country to the west was drawing men by the hundred, but I had come in from Nevada ahead of the main rush and knew enough about diggings to be useful in the valley as a survey hand and occasional freighter, while I figured out my next move. Dearborn introduced me to the town, and the town included Nora Callum, who handled the post. She was 26 then and had been handling the post for 3 years, having taken it over from her father when he got sick. She was not the sort of woman who drew a lot of easy attention. She was quiet, and she tended to look at you with a steadiness that made some men uncomfortable, as though she were adding something up and not yet arriving at a sum. I did not find it uncomfortable. I found it restful, in a way I had not found anything restful in a long time. I began stopping at the postal house for no particular reason. There was nothing to stop for. I received no letters, had no one to send them to, but I found reasons. I would ask Nora whether any mail had come in for Dearborn that might concern a freighting contract. She would say she was not at liberty to discuss other people's mail. I would say I understood. I would then stand there for a while anyway, and she would eventually offer me coffee, and I would stay for the coffee. This went on for about 4 months before she said, plainly and without any particular build-up, that if I was going to keep coming around, I should probably have a reason that did not require her to maintain the fiction that I was interested in Dearborn's correspondence. I told her the reason was that I liked talking to her. She said she liked talking to me too. That was the beginning. We were together for 2 years. 2 good years, not perfect ones. I was restless in those years, and restless men are not easy to be around, and Nora was honest enough to tell me so. She was not unkind about it. She simply named what she saw, that I had 1 foot in Harlan's Crossing and 1 foot pointed west toward the silver country, and that she could not build anything with a man whose feet were not in the same place. She said this not as an ultimatum but as an observation, the way she would observe that the post was late or that the weather had turned. She was a practical woman. She dealt in what was true. What was true was that I wanted the silver. I had always wanted it, the way young men want the thing that will make them into something solid and settled and worth accounting. The silver was the plan. Get enough of it, come back to Harlan's Crossing, buy the east side land, build the house with the window facing the mountains, and then be the kind of man a woman like Nora Callum could build a life with. She did not think much of this plan. She told me so. She said the silver was what men wanted before they understood what they actually needed, and that in her experience the men who went off after it generally came back changed in ways that were not improvements. She said she was not telling me not to go. She was telling me what she thought. I went anyway. I am not going to tell you I was not told. I was told. I simply did not listen, which is the particular stupidity of young men who have made up their minds. I left in the 2nd autumn we were together, October, the cottonwoods yellow, the same as the morning I came back. I told her I would write. I told her I would be back inside of a year, maybe 2. She stood on the step of the postal house and watched me ride out, and she did not say anything more than she had already said, because she had said everything there was to say and she knew it, and she was not the kind of woman to repeat herself. The first year in the Nevada diggings was hard. The second was harder. The third broke something in me that took a long while to name, not my health, not exactly my will, but my certainty. The thing that had driven me west, the bone-deep conviction that the silver was out there, and that I was the man to find it, that wore away like chalk in the rain. I had partners in those years, good men and bad ones, and we made finds and lost them and made them again and lost them again. And by the fifth year, I had enough to my name to live on for a while, but not enough to do what I'd set out to do. I wrote to Nora. I wrote many times in those first years. Long letters and short ones, honest ones and ones that put too good a face on things. I wrote to the postal house in Harlan's Crossing, which seemed straightforward enough. She ran the postal house. She would receive the letters. I never received a reply. I told myself she was busy. I told myself the letters were slow. I told myself all the things a man tells himself when he does not want to consider the other possibility, which was that she had read them and decided she had nothing to say. By the 7th year, I had stopped writing. By the 10th year, I had stopped letting myself think about Harlan's Crossing for more than a minute at a stretch, because a minute was all I could manage before it became something that sat too heavy. I drifted after the silver. I worked other men's claims and then my own. I went north into Idaho and south again. I worked a season as a freighter on the Humboldt Road and another as a survey hand up near the Oregon border. I was not unhappy exactly. I was the way a man is when he has organized his life around the absence of the thing he actually wants, functional, purposeful, and hollow in a way he has learned not to examine. It was the Cornish miner Avery who broke through it, the way I said. He told me what he told me, and he died 3 days later in the lower level, and I sat in the rooming house in Elko in the rain and wrote the letter I never sent, and then folded it into my breast pocket and rode south. I did not let myself think too hard about what I was riding toward. A man who thinks too hard about a thing like that will talk himself out of it. I rode. The letter was in my pocket. The gray horse moved steadily south. The October cold came down off the mountains. And then I was in Harlan's Crossing, and the lamp was in the window, and Nora Callum opened the door before I could knock. She made coffee. This should not be remarkable, but it was, because it was the same coffee, the same pot, I would have sworn, the same blue enamel, the same wood smoke coming up off the same stove, and sitting at the table in the sorting room while she made it felt like sitting inside 15 years ago and the present moment simultaneously, which was a disorienting sensation for a man who had ridden 260 miles to get there. I looked around the room while she worked. The sorting cubbies were the same. The front counter was the same. The 2 chairs by the stove were different. The old ones had been ladder-back. These were a heavier style, caned, but they were in the same positions. Everything in the room had the quality of having been maintained rather than left. There is a difference. Things that are left gather dust and settle into themselves. Things that are maintained stay upright and purposeful, as though someone has decided they are worth keeping in working order. She set the cups on the table and sat across from me. I said, "The lamp." She said, "Yes." I said, "It was in the window this morning." She said, "It is in the window most mornings." I said, "Why?" She looked at me in that way she had always had, adding something up, not yet at the sum. Then she said, "I suppose for the same reason I always kept it there." I did not push that. Not yet. There was a particular quality to the silence between us that was not uncomfortable. It had weight, but it was not hostile weight. It was the weight of a great many things that had not been said for a long time, and were now being handled carefully, the way you handle something you know has edges. She asked me where I had been. I told her. Not all of it at once, but the shape of it, the Nevada diggings, the years up north, the freighting work, Avery, Elko. She listened the way she had always listened, which was completely, without interrupting, with her hands around her cup. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You stopped writing." I said, "You never wrote back." She set her cup down. She looked at me. She said, "I never received anything to write back to." I said, "I wrote to you, the first 5 years at least. I wrote a good number of letters." She said nothing came. We looked at each other across the table. I thought about the letters, long letters, short letters. The address was right, the postal house, Harlan's Crossing, Sutter County. She ran the postal house. She sorted every piece of mail that came through. She said quietly, "The Carson route was unreliable for a number of years. There was a period, I believe from about 81 to 85, when they were losing freight on the high pass. Whole mail bags." I said 4 years. She said at least. I said and before that. She said before that I received one letter, in the spring of your first year out. I wrote back to the address you gave me, and the letter came back 6 months later, marked undeliverable. I sat with this for a moment. One letter. She had written back and the letter had come back to her. Then 4 years of a broken route. By the time the route was reliable again, I had stopped writing. I said, "I thought you had decided not to answer." She said, "I thought you had decided not to write." The room was quiet, the stove ticked. She said, "I am not angry about it, Reuben. I want you to know that. I was for a while. But I came to understand that the post is not a reliable instrument, and that we had both done what we could with what we had." I said, "That is a very reasonable way to look at it." She said, "I am a reasonable woman." I said, "You are." She said, "That does not mean it was easy." I said, "No." She looked at her cup. "I kept thinking you would ride back in. For years I thought that. Not every day, a person cannot live on that every day, but often enough." I said, "I kept thinking I would come back when I had something to come back with." She said, "And do you?" I thought about the letter in my breast pocket. I thought about the gray horse at the post rail outside, and the money in my pack, and the 260 miles of October road behind me, and Avery dying in the lower level 3 days, after telling me the one useful thing anyone had told me in years. I said, "I have a letter I wrote you, and a gray horse, and enough money to last a while." She said, "Is that all?" I said, "I have 15 years of being wrong about what matters." She looked at me, that same steady look adding something up. She said, "That is something, I suppose." I stayed in Harlan's Crossing. This requires some explanation, because a man does not simply decide to stay in a place after 15 years away and have it be a simple thing. There is the practical matter of where to sleep, which Dearborn's son, young Cord Dearborn, who had taken over the mercantile from his father, solved by offering me the use of a room above the store at a fair rate. There is the matter of work, which presented itself in the form of the postal freight run that served the outlying farms and the 2 cattle stations east of town, a route that had been without a reliable man since the previous spring. And there is the matter of what it means to re-enter a place you have been absent from for a long time, the looks, the questions, the knowledge that every person in the town is doing arithmetic in their head about you. None of this was pleasant, exactly, but none of it was as hard as I had expected. The town had changed, and it had not changed. The faces were different in some cases. Men had moved on, women had married and moved, a few had died, but the shape of the place was the same, the rhythm of it, the way it moved through its days. Small towns have that quality. They are like rivers, the water is always different but the channel stays. Nora and I talked every day. This was natural. I was running the postal freight, which meant I was in and out of the sorting office constantly. We talked the way people who have a great deal of lost ground to cover talk, which is carefully at first, and then with increasing ease, The way a road that starts rocky will often smooth out if you stay on it long enough. She had not married. I want to record this without making too much of it, because she was not the kind of woman who needed to be married to be whole, and I had no right to any particular feelings about her choices in my absence. But the fact of it settled in me in a way I could not pretend it didn't. She had not married. She had run the post office, and she had taken in sewing work on the side, and she had kept the lamp in the window, and she had made a full and functional life in Harlan's Crossing by herself. When I said this to her, she corrected me. She said she had not done it by herself. She had done it with the town, which was a different thing. She said Harlan's Crossing had been good to her, and she had tried to be good to it in return. I said, the lamp. She said, the lamp. I said, you said once you kept it for anyone coming toward it who needed to know something warm was on the other side. She said, I did say that. I said, I need to know whether you were keeping it for anyone or for someone in particular. She looked at me for a long moment in that measuring way. She said, I kept it for the town. I kept it because it was a habit and because I am not someone who gives up habits easily. I kept it because a lamp in the window is a decent thing to do. She paused. She said, and I kept it because I thought that if you ever rode back in, I wanted you to be able to see something that was still familiar. I said, that is a kind thing. She said it was not entirely kind. It was somewhat stubborn. I am a stubborn woman. I said, I know. She said, that does not trouble you. I said, Nora, I rode 260 miles to see a lamp in a window. Stubborn is about the most welcome quality in the world to me right now. She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh in 15 years, and it landed on me like the first warm day after a long winter. There was a conversation we needed to have about the silver, and about what I had and had not come back with, and we had it in pieces over the first 2 weeks. She was not a woman who cared about money in the way some people care about it, as a measure of worth, as a proof of something. She had lived carefully and managed well, and she did not need rescuing in any financial sense. But she had a practical mind, and she wanted to know what the situation was, and I respected that enough to tell her the truth of it without softening the edges. The truth was this: I had not found the silver, not in the amount I had gone after. I had found some, worked some, and lost some in bad partnerships. What I had now was enough to buy a small piece of ground and make a start, not enough to do it in the grand style I had once pictured. The house with the window facing the mountains was still possible. It was just going to be a modest house, and the window would have to earn its grandeur through the view rather than the construction. She said that seemed fine. I said I had wanted to come back with more. She said, you came back. That is the relevant thing. I said I had a plan. She said, I know you did. You always had a plan. She paused. The plan was always the problem, Reuben, not the silver. The silver was just what the plan pointed at. The plan was the way you told yourself you needed to earn the right to stay somewhere. I sat with that for a while, because it was accurate in a way that was uncomfortable. She said, you did not need to earn it. You just needed to want it badly enough to stop leaving. I said I stopped. She said, yes, you did. That was not the end of that conversation, but it was the end of the part that needed saying. The rest of it was the practical business of two people who have arrived, after a long and circuitous route, at the same place at the same time, and who are trying to figure out what to do next without making the same errors they made before. We did not rush it. I want to record that too. We did not rush it the way young people rush things, trading the careful for the quick. We were both in our 40s, which is old enough to know that the careful is worth the time it takes. There was an afternoon in the 3rd week when I rode the freight route out to the Haskell station. One of the cattle spreads east of town, and came back in the early dark with the wagon empty and the gray horse blowing easy in the cold. I came up the main street, and I could see the lamp in the postal house window from the south end of the road, 200 yards off, orange and still in the November air. I pulled up for a moment the way I had pulled up on that first morning, just looking at it. There is something about a light in a window at the end of a dark road that reaches into a man and touches something older than language. It is not about the light, exactly. It is about the promise of the light. The promise that there is a place at the end of the cold and the dark where something is waiting, something warm and known, something that expects you. I had ridden toward a great many things in my life, digs and claims and contracts and roads. I had ridden away from things, too, which I had once told myself was the same as riding toward something new. It was not the same. I understood that now. Riding away is just moving. It has no destination, only a direction. Riding toward is different. Riding toward is an act of the will. I rode toward the lamp. Nora was in the sorting room when I came in, logging the day's deliveries in her ledger, the way she did every evening. She looked up. She said, "How was the Haskell route?" I said, "Cold. They sent back 4 crates for the mercantile and 2 letters for town." She held out her hand for the letters. I gave them to her. She sorted them into the cubbies with the efficient, practiced motion of someone who has done a thing so many times that it is simply part of how she moves through the world. I said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." I said, "I have been thinking about the East Side land." She set down her pen. She looked at me. I said, "The parcel Dearborn's boy mentioned is still available. I went and looked at it last week, out past the creek bend. It is flat enough to build on, and there is water access, and the mountain view it is a good view." She said, "I know the parcel." I said, "I cannot build anything on it alone. That is a practical observation, not a—" I stopped. "What I mean to say is that I have not come back here to live in a room above the mercantile for the rest of my life. I came back because of you, and I would like, if you are willing, to discuss what it would mean to not waste any more time." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "You could have said that differently." I said, "I know, I am not good at the pretty version." She said, "No, you never were." She looked down at her ledger, then back up. "But you are good at the honest version." I said, "I am trying to be." She said, "The parcel has good drainage. I have always thought so." I said, is that a yes?" She said, "It is a woman telling you about drainage, Reuben. You will know when it is a yes." The yes came on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later. We were on the step of the postal house in the early dark, the temperature well down and the first real cold of winter in the air. She had brought out a blanket, one of those heavy wool ones in blue and green that she kept in the cedar chest, and we were sitting side by side under it, which was itself a kind of answer, though I had not been certain at the time. She said, "The parcel." I said, "Yes." She said, "If we are going to build on it, we should do it right. A proper house, not rushed." I said, "Agreed." She said, "The window facing the mountains." I said, "That was always the plan." She said, "It was your plan. I am making it mine now." I said, "All right." She said, "And the lamp?" I said, "What about it?" She said, "I am bringing the lamp. It goes in whatever window faces the road. That is not negotiable." I said, "I would not dream of negotiating it." She looked at the street, the familiar length of it, the dark storefronts and the lantern at the far end. She said, "I am not a young woman, Reuben. I do not have the patience for uncertainty that I had at 26. I said, "I am not a young man. I have had enough uncertainty to last me." She said, "Then we understand each other." I said, "We always did. That was never the problem." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, it was not." She turned to look at me, and in the light from the window above us her face had that quality it had always had, steady, legible, honest in a way that most faces are not. She said, "Ask me properly then." I said, "Nora Callum." I spent 15 years learning the one thing I should have known when I was 30, which is that there is nothing I want more than to be in the same place as you. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking plainly, and I mean it completely." She said yes. Just that. Just yes. The way she said most things, without elaboration, without qualification, as though the word were sufficient and any more would be padding. It was sufficient. We were married in the courthouse at Sutter Falls on a Tuesday in the first week of December. A plain ceremony with Cord Dearborn and his wife as witnesses, and a judge who had been on the circuit for 30 years, and had seen every variety of human decision, and seemed to find ours unremarkable in the best possible way. It was cold and clear, and the mountains were white above the tree line. Nora wore a charcoal dress with a cream collar that she had made herself, because she made most of her own things, and she looked like exactly what she was, a practical, dignified, unhurried woman who had decided on a course and was proceeding with it. I wore the best of what I had, which was a dark coat and a clean shirt and boots that I had actually shined, which Cord Dearborn pointed out was the clearest evidence he had that I was serious about the whole enterprise. We drove back to Harlan's Crossing in the afternoon, and the mountain light was the cold blue gold of early December, and the gray horse pulled the wagon steadily, and we did not say much on the road. There was not much that needed saying. We had done a great deal of talking in the preceding weeks, the useful kind of talking, the kind that gets things settled, and what was left was the comfortable quiet of two people who have arrived somewhere together. She put the lamp in the window of the sorting room that night, the same as she always did. I asked her why, given that she was no longer alone. She said habit. I said just habit. She thought about it. She said, "A lamp in a window is a courtesy to whatever darkness is outside it. That does not change because I am not alone. It just changes what the lamp is saying." I said, "What is it saying now?" She said, "Now it is saying that something warm is here and that we are both on the inside of it." We broke ground on the east side parcel in April, as soon as the frost was out of the ground. I did most of the framing work myself, with help from Cord Dearborn's hired man on the heavy timber, and from two brothers named Pratt who were good with a saw and needed the work. Nora made the decisions about the layout with a quiet authority that I had no inclination to dispute. She had been thinking about a house for 15 years, and she knew what she wanted. She wanted the kitchen at the back where the morning light came in. She wanted a root cellar with proper drainage and a cistern at the east corner. She wanted 2 rooms upstairs for reasons she declined to elaborate on, which I chose not to examine too closely. She wanted a porch facing south and the window facing the mountains. The window was the last thing we worked out. Not the construction of it, that was straightforward enough, but the question of what it was for, now that we were building it ourselves rather than talking about it as a thing that might someday exist. I asked her once, while we were looking at the framed opening in the west wall on a late May afternoon, with the mountains clear and pale blue ahead of us, what she had imagined when she imagined this window. She said, "I imagined sitting in it in the evenings, looking at the mountains." I said, "That's all." She said, "And you next to me." I said, "That is a simpler picture than I expected." She said, "I am a simple person." I said, "You are the least simple person I have ever known." She said, "I am consistent. People confuse consistency with simplicity." I said, "Fair enough." She said, "What did you imagine when you imagined it?" I thought about that. The truth was that I had not imagined it in detail. I had imagined it as an abstraction, as the proof of something, the physical evidence that I had done what I'd set out to do. The house with the window facing the mountains had not been a house in my imagination so much as a certificate of adequacy, a sign that I had earned the right to stay. I said, "I imagined it as the end of something." She said, "And now?" I looked at the framed opening, the mountains beyond it, the late May light coming through at the angle it would always come through on evenings like this. I said, "Now it looks more like the beginning." She put her hand on my arm, which was a gesture she used rarely and deliberately, and which carried in it more than most people convey in a great many words. We went on building. We moved into the house in August, before it was entirely finished. There was still trim work to be done in the 2 upstairs rooms, and the porch rail was not yet set. But the kitchen was done, and the root cellar was sealed, and the window was in. Nora moved the lamp from the postal house on the morning we brought the last of her things over. She carried it herself, wrapped in a length of cotton, and set it in the window that faced the road without ceremony, the way she did most things. That evening we sat on the south porch in the warm August dark and looked at the mountains, which were invisible except as an absence of stars where they blocked the sky. There was a frog singing somewhere near the creek. The lamp was behind us in the west window, and I could see its reflection faintly in the glass of the door. I said, "The lamp." She said, "Yes." I said, "Same window." She said, "A lamp in a window is a lamp in a window." I said, "Different house." She said, "Yes." "Different house." I said, "Same lamp." She looked over at me. Even in the dark I knew the look. She said, "Same lamp, same woman, different circumstances." I said, "Better circumstances." She said, "Considerably better." I said, "I am sorry it took me so long." She said, "You arrived when you arrived. That is the relevant thing." I said, "You always say that." She said, "It keeps being true." The porch rail went up in September, which was when the cottonwoods went gold again. 1 full year since I had ridden back into Harlan's Crossing on the gray horse with no plan and the letter in my pocket. The mountains in the morning had the particular clarity of early autumn, the kind of clarity that makes everything look close enough to touch. Nora brought coffee out to the porch in the morning before she rode into town for the post. She had kept the postal contract and went in 3 mornings a week, which suited her and which Cord Dearborn's wife, who was learning the work, was increasingly well equipped to handle without her. I sat on the porch and drank the coffee and looked at the mountains. There had been a version of this moment in my mind for 15 years, not quite this version, not the actual porch and the actual house and the actual woman coming through the door with actual coffee, but something like it. The settled thing, the arrived thing, the thing that did not require you to keep writing. It had not been what I expected. It was not a certificate. It was not a proof of anything. It was just the morning, and the mountains, and the coffee, and in a moment Nora would come back out and sit in the other chair, and we would be 2 people on a porch in the early autumn of their lives, which is not a grand thing by any particular measure, but which is, in my experience, exactly the right kind of thing to be. She came back out. She sat in the other chair. She put her coffee cup on the rail and looked at the mountains. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. We sat there in the particular quiet of 2 people who have run out of the need to fill silence, because the silence itself has become a kind of conversation, fluent and sufficient and warm. The lamp was in the window behind us. I had a thought then that I have had many times since, and which I will set down here as the closest thing to a conclusion I can offer. A man spends a good deal of his life trying to arrive at places he thinks will change him into what he wants to be. He rides toward the silver and the claim and the proof. He makes plans. He believes, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has not yet learned better, that the arriving is the point, that when he gets there, some essential thing will click into place and he will be finished, settled, complete. But the arriving is not the point. The lamp in the window is the point. The lamp is the thing that says, here is the place, here is the warmth that is for you, here is the person who kept it lit while you were away. All I had to do was ride toward it. All I had to do, and this is the thing that takes a man 15 years to understand, if he is slow about it, which I was was stop riding away. She was right, Nora Callum. She was right about most things. I just needed to stay long enough to know it.